History lovers, welcome back. Today, we're traveling through centuries of epic turning points, all packed into one single date, September 20th. But here's the twist. What do the Prophet Muhammad's migration, Saladin's legendary siege of Jerusalem, Magellan's daring voyage to circumnavigate the globe, Galileo's trial for challenging the church, and John Lennon walking away from the Beatles all have in common? The answer is hidden in today's journey through history, moments of courage, rebellion, discovery, tragedy, and triumph. From the deserts of Arabia to the oceans of the world, from the halls of science to the stage of rock and roll, September 20th has seen it all. Stay tuned, because each story we uncover doesn't just belong to the past, it still shapes the world we live in today. In the year one of the most defining moments in world history unfolded in events so important that it became the very foundation of the Islamic calendar. This was the Hijra, the migration of Prophet Muhammad and his loyal companion Abu Bakr from Mecca to Medina. But to truly understand why this moment matters, we need to step back for a moment and look at the world of 7th century Arabia. Mecca, the Prophet's birthplace, was a city of commerce, religion, and tribal power. It was home to the Kaaba, the sacred sanctuary that drew pilgrims from across the Arabian Peninsula. Yet for Muhammad and his followers, Mecca had become a place of danger. His message of monotheism, worshipping one God alone, challenged the powerful Quraysh tribe, who saw his teachings as a direct threat to their wealth, traditions, and authority. For more than a decade, the Prophet endured persecution, mockery, and even physical threats. Many of his followers were tortured, some killed. The Quraysh tried to silence him at every turn, and yet his message continued to spread. By 622, the situation had reached a breaking point. The leaders of Mecca plotted to assassinate Muhammad, believing that eliminating him would end the new faith once and for all. But history had other plans. On the night of his planned assassination, the Prophet secretly left Mecca. According to tradition, he asked his cousin Ali to sleep in his bed as a decoy, while he and Abu Bakr slipped into the desert under the cover of darkness. Their escape was filled with danger. At one point, they took refuge in the cave of Thor, hiding from pursuers who searched relentlessly. It's said that when enemies approached the entrance, they turned back, believing no one could be inside because a spider had spun a web across the cave's mouth and a bird had nested there, making it seem untouched. To Muslims, this became a symbol of divine protection. After days of travel across the harsh Arabian landscape, Muhammad and Abu Bakr finally reached Medina, then known as Yathrib. But this was not just a safe refuge, it was the beginning of something new. The people of Medina, already divided by tribal rivalries, welcomed him not only as a spiritual leader, but also as a mediator and statesman. The Prophet established what historians often call the Constitution of Medina, an agreement that united Muslims, Jews, and other tribes under a single community. It set rules for justice, mutual defense, and coexistence remarkably progressive for its time. This migration was not simply about survival. It marked the transition from Islam as a persecuted faith to Islam as a flourishing society. The Hijra was the foundation of the first Muslim community, an ummah built on faith, unity, and social justice. And its impact has echoed across centuries. Think about this. The Islamic calendar itself begins not with the Prophet's birth, not with the first revelation, but with the Hijra. Why? Because it represents a turning point. The moment faith moved from private belief to a structured society capable of changing the world. The courage it took to leave behind home, family, and safety to build something entirely new cannot be overstated. Muhammad and Abu Bakr's journey was filled with risk. But it was also filled with vision, the belief that out of hardship, a just and moral society could be born. Even today, nearly 1,400 years later, the Hijra continues to inspire. For Muslims, it is a story of resilience and trust in God's plan. For historians, it is one of the clearest examples of how a single decision, a journey across the desert, reshaped the course of world history. And that all began on September 20th, 622, the night two men left Mecca, and the world was never the same again. Fast forward to the year 1187. The Crusades had already raged for nearly a century. Jerusalem, the holy city sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, had been under Crusader control since 1099, when European knights stormed its walls in the First Crusade. That conquest had been brutal, with reports of horrific massacres of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. For decades, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood as the proud symbol of Crusader power in the Holy Land. But in July of 1187, everything changed. At the Battle of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee, the Muslim leader Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West simply as Saladin, crushed the Crusader armies. His disciplined forces encircled the Christian knights under King Guy of Lusignan, cutting them off from water in the blazing heat. By the battle's end, most of the Crusader nobility had been killed or captured, and the famed True Cross, one of Christianity's holiest relics, was seized. With the Crusader military in ruins, the road to Jerusalem lay open. Now imagine the tension in the city. The people of Jerusalem knew Saladin was coming. The once mighty Crusader states were collapsing around them, castles and strongholds falling one by one. By late September, Saladin's forces encircled Jerusalem. Inside the walls, Balian of Iblan, one of the few remaining leaders, organized the defense. But supplies were limited and morale was fragile. Jerusalem was more than just a fortress, it was the spiritual heart of three religions. To the Crusaders, losing the city meant losing the very prize that had drawn them from Europe nearly a century earlier. To Muslims, reclaiming it was both a religious duty and a chance to heal the wounds of 1099. For nearly 2 weeks, Saladin's forces bombarded the city with catapults and siege towers. The defenders fought desperately, launching counterattacks and even threatening to destroy the holy sites rather than surrender them. But Saladin was patient and relentless. Eventually, the defenders realized the situation was hopeless. And here is where history takes an unexpected turn. When Jerusalem fell in 1099, it was soaked in blood. But Saladin chose a different path. On October 2nd, 1187, the city formally surrendered. Instead of slaughter, Saladin offered terms of ransom. Christian inhabitants could pay for their freedom and leave safely. Those who could not pay were, in many cases, freed through the generosity of Saladin and his commanders. Churches were respected, holy sites preserved, and even some Christian institutions were allowed to continue. Contemporary accounts from both Muslim and Christian chroniclers highlight Saladin's mercy. His treatment of Jerusalem's population shocked Europe, but it also earned him admiration even from his enemies. In fact, Richard the Lionheart, one of the most famous Crusader kings of the Third Crusade, would later respect Saladin as a noble adversary, despite their bloody clashes. The capture of Jerusalem in 1187 was not just a military victory, it was a symbolic earthquake. Across Europe, news of the loss of the Holy City sparked outrage and sorrow. Pope Urban III is said to have died of grief upon hearing the news. Within months, a new wave of crusades, the Third Crusade, was launched. With kings like Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa marching east. But, despite all their efforts, Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control for most of the following centuries. So, why does this moment matter? Because Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem changed the narrative of the Crusades. It showed that power could shift, that empires could rise and fall, and that even in war, mercy could leave a lasting legacy. His actions stood in stark contrast to the brutality of earlier Crusader conquests, and his reputation as a just and honorable leader endured long after his death. On September 20th, 1187, the siege of Jerusalem wasn't just about capturing a city, it was about reclaiming dignity, reshaping the balance of power, and reminding the world that leadership can be measured not only in victories, but also in mercies. Let's journey back to September 20th, 1519. Picture the bustling port of Seville, Spain. The docks were alive with sailors shouting orders, merchants haggling over supplies, and priests offering blessings for safe passage. On this day, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing under the Spanish crown, set out with 5 ships and about 270 men. His goal, to find a westward route to the Spice Islands, the fabled source of cloves, nutmeg, and other spices that were worth their weight in gold. Now, to really grasp the enormity of this voyage, we need to remember the context. At this time, the world was only partially mapped. Europe knew of the Atlantic, parts of Africa, and Asia through eastern routes, but the Pacific Ocean was a complete mystery. Many sailors still feared the unknown, whispering tales of sea monsters and endless oceans where ships would vanish forever. Magellan, however, believed that by sailing west, he could reach the rich Spice Islands without going around Africa. It was a bold gamble that would change the course of history. The fleet that departed that day consisted of 5 ships: the Trinidad Magellan's flagship, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago. They were loaded with provisions, weaponry, and trade goods. But beyond the supplies, the men carried a mix of emotions, excitement, fear, and uncertainty. They knew they were venturing into the unknown. From the start, Magellan's journey was fraught with challenges. Navigating across the Atlantic, the fleet faced storms, shortages of food, and growing tensions among the crew. Remember, Magellan was Portuguese, but most of his sailors were Spanish. Many resented taking orders from a foreigner, and this tension would later spark mutiny. Still, Magellan pressed on. After months of sailing, he reached the coast of South America. There, the expedition began, the difficult search for a passage that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. For weeks, they explored rivers, bays, and coastlines, unsure if such a passage even existed. The crew's morale plummeted. Supplies dwindled, mutiny broke out, and Magellan had to put down the rebellion with firm discipline, executing some and marooning others. His leadership was tested at every turn. Finally, after enduring hunger, frost, and treacherous waters, Magellan discovered what we now call the Strait of Magellan at the southern tip of South America. It was a narrow, winding, and perilous route, but it opened into the vast Pacific Ocean. This was a historic breakthrough, the key to proving that the Atlantic and Pacific were connected. Yet, the Pacific was not the peaceful body of water Magellan had hoped for. Crossing it took more than 3 months, during which his men suffered from scurvy, starvation, and exhaustion. They ran out of food, resorting to eating leather and sawdust. Many died along the way. Magellan himself would never complete the journey. In 1521, he was killed in the Philippines during a conflict with local warriors. But his expedition continued under new leadership, and in 1522, the remaining ship, the Victoria, limped back to Spain with just 18 survivors. They had circumnavigated the globe, the first humans to ever do so. Think about that for a moment. From 5 ships and 270 men, only 1 ship and a handful of sailors returned. Yet their journey shattered old worldviews. They proved the Earth was round not just in theory, but in practice. They revealed the true scale of the oceans and interconnected continents. This voyage forever changed global trade, navigation, and our understanding of the planet. So when we talk about Magellan setting sail on September 20th, 1519, we're not just remembering a departure. We're remembering the first step in one of the most daring and transformative voyages in history. A journey that took incredible bravery, resilience, and vision, and one that ultimately proved the world was far bigger and far more connected than anyone had imagined. Let's step into the year 1633, a time when Europe was still shaped by the power of the Church. When questioning long-standing beliefs could cost you your freedom, or even your life. In Rome, a frail but determined man named Galileo Galilei stood before the Inquisition. His so-called crime, daring to say that the Earth revolved around the sun. To understand why this moment was so explosive, we have to go back a few decades. Galileo had spent years perfecting the telescope, an invention that transformed how humanity saw the heavens. Through his lens, he discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, mountains on the moon, and the phases of Venus, clear evidence that not everything revolved around Earth. These observations strongly supported the Copernican model, proposed almost a century earlier by Nicolaus Copernicus, which placed the sun, not the Earth, at the center of the universe. But here's the problem. For centuries, church doctrine had been built on the Ptolemaic system, the belief that Earth was the unmoving center of creation. This wasn't just science, it was theology. To challenge it was to challenge authority itself. At first, Galileo was careful. He presented his findings cautiously, framing them as hypotheses. But his writings, especially his book dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems, made his support for heliocentrism crystal clear. The book was written in the form of a dialogue, but one character named Simplicio was portrayed as stubborn and foolish, defending the Earth-centered model. Many readers, including officials in the church, thought Galileo was mocking them. By 1633, the patience of the Roman Inquisition had run out. Galileo was summoned to Rome, placed under investigation, and eventually forced to stand trial. Imagine the scene. an elderly man in his late 60s, kneeling before a tribunal of cardinals, pressured to renounce his life's work. The Inquisition accused him of heresy, of spreading dangerous ideas that could shake the very foundations of faith and authority. The outcome was devastating for Galileo. Under threat of torture, he was forced to recant his belief in a sun-centered universe. Legend says that after he recanted, he whispered the words "E per si muove," and yet it moves. Whether true or not, this phrase captures his unbroken spirit. Officially, Galileo was condemned, his book was banned, and he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life under house arrest. But here's the remarkable part. While the church silenced Galileo, his discoveries could not be undone. His work circulated quietly across Europe, inspiring other scientists like Johannes Kepler and later Isaac Newton, who would build on his foundation. Galileo's methods of careful observation, experimentation, and reliance on evidence became the cornerstones of modern science. Galileo once said, "All truths are easy to understand once they are discovered. The point is to discover them." His willingness to risk everything for the pursuit of truth left a legacy that has outlived the walls of the Inquisition. So, when we remember 1633, we're not just recalling a trial, we're witnessing a turning point in human thought. Galileo may have been silenced in his lifetime, but his vision opened the door to the scientific revolution. Today, every time we look through a telescope, launch a spacecraft, or simply gaze at the stars, we're continuing the journey he began. Let's rewind to September 20th, 1946. The world was still reeling from the devastation of World War II. Cities lay in ruins, millions of lives had been lost, and the scars of conflict were everywhere. But amid this darkness, there was also a deep hunger for renewal, for beauty, and for cultural rebirth. It was in this fragile but hopeful moment that the first Cannes Film Festival opened its doors in France. Now, why Cannes? Before the war, European film festivals were dominated by Venice, but by the late 1930s, the Venice Film Festival had become heavily influenced by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. France wanted an alternative, an international celebration of cinema, free from political manipulation. Plans were drawn up as early as 1939, but the outbreak of World War II delayed everything. Only after the war's end could the dream of Cannes truly come to life. When the festival finally began in 1946, it wasn't the polished, glitzy event we think of today. The screenings took place in an old casino on the French Riviera. The red carpet, now a global icon, was just a simple staircase back then. But the spirit was electric. Directors, actors, and artists from around the world gathered to showcase their work. It was the first true international cultural event of the post-war world. And here's something fascinating. The lineup of films that year was extraordinary. The very first Cannes featured movies from across the globe, including works by Roberto Rossellini of Italy, Alfred Hitchcock of Britain, and George Cukor of the United States. The festival jury was so overwhelmed by the variety and quality that instead of awarding a single top prize, it gave the Grand Prix to 11 films. It was a gesture of unity, as if to say, cinema belongs to everyone, not just one nation. But Cannes was never just about films. It was about what films represented. Think about it. Just 1 year earlier, Europe was shattered. And now, in this beautiful seaside town, artists were gathering to tell stories again, to laugh, to cry, to imagine futures beyond destruction. For audiences, it was more than entertainment. It was proof that humanity's creative spirit had survived the war. Over time, Cannes grew into the most prestigious film festival in the world. It became the place where directors could launch their careers, where political films could spark global debates, and where art house cinema could stand alongside Hollywood blockbusters. Of course, the glamour grew to the Riviera, the luxury hotels, the flashing cameras, but beneath the glitter, Cannes remained a symbol of something deeper. The idea that storytelling can heal, inspire, and unite. The legacy of that first festival still echoes today. Every May, when filmmakers and fans gather in Cannes, they're not just celebrating cinema, they're celebrating resilience. They're honoring the idea that even after humanity's darkest chapters, art can bring people back together. So when we look back at September 20th, 1946, we're seeing more than just a film festival premiere. We're witnessing the beginning of a global stage that would forever change how movies are shared, celebrated, and remembered. From that modest casino in Cannes, the world was reminded that creativity is not a luxury, it's a lifeline. Let's travel back to 1951, a pivotal year in the early Cold War. The guns of World War II had fallen silent just a few years earlier. But the world was already divided into two camps, East and West. On one side, the Soviet Union and its communist allies. On the other, the United States, Western Europe, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. And on February 18, 1952, after months of negotiation and preparation, Turkey officially joined NATO, a decision that would shape its destiny for decades to come. Now, why was this such a big deal? To understand that, you need to picture Turkey's unique position. Geographically, it sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling access to the Black Sea through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. For centuries, these waterways had been the prize of empires, and in the Cold War, they were no less important. Whoever controlled them could influence Soviet naval movement and, by extension, the balance of power in the Mediterranean. After World War II, Turkey found itself in a dangerous position. The Soviet Union was pressuring Ankara, demanding joint control over the straits and even making territorial claims in eastern Anatolia. For Turkey, these demands were existential threats. The country needed powerful allies to survive, and that's where NATO came in. But here's the twist. Turkey didn't just walk into NATO, it had to prove itself. During the Korean War, which broke out in 1950, Turkey sent an entire brigade of troops to fight alongside UN forces. Their bravery in battles like Kanuri earned international respect, showing that Turkey was not only willing to align with the West, but also capable of fighting alongside it. This commitment played a huge role in convincing NATO leaders that Turkey belonged in the alliance. When membership finally came, it was historic. Turkey, along with Greece, became the first countries to join NATO after its founding. For Turkey, it meant protection under Article 5, the promise that if one member is attacked, all others will respond. But it also meant a deep political statement. Turkey was choosing the Western Bloc over the Soviet sphere. The impact was immediate and long-lasting. Strategically, NATO now had a foothold right on the Soviet border. U.S. bases and listening posts soon dotted Turkish soil, making the country a frontline state in the Cold War. Politically, Turkey's membership tied its future to Western institutions, influencing everything from military reforms to foreign policy decisions for decades. Of course, it wasn't always an easy relationship. Tensions flared during events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey became part of a high-stakes negotiation with Moscow. And over the years, disagreements within the alliance sometimes tested Ankara's patience. But through it all, NATO membership gave Turkey a sense of security and a place at the table in global politics. Looking back, joining NATO was more than just a military move for Turkey. It was a declaration of identity, an assertion that this ancient nation at the crossroads of continents would stand with the West in the great ideological battle of the 20th century, and that choice continues to shape Turkey's role in world affairs even today. So, when we think of February 1952 and Turkey's entry into NATO, we're not just marking a treaty signing. We're seeing the moment when geography, politics, and history collided, turning Turkey into one of the most strategically important members of the alliance, a position it still holds to this very day. Let's move forward to 1969, a year that symbolized both cultural revolution and deep division. The Vietnam War was raging. Woodstock had just brought together 500,000 people in a celebration of peace and music, and the counterculture was in full swing. Yet in the middle of all this, one announcement shook the world of music forever. John Lennon revealed that he was leaving the Beatles. Now, to understand the weight of this moment, you have to remember what the Beatles were in the 1960s. They weren't just a band, they were a phenomenon. From their debut on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 to stadium tours that redefined live performance. The Fab Four, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, had become the voice of a generation. Their music wasn't just entertainment. It was the soundtrack of social change. From the optimism of All You Need Is Love to the psychedelic journey of SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But by 1969, things weren't as harmonious behind the scenes. Creative tensions were mounting. Paul McCartney wanted to keep the group tightly knit and professional, while John Lennon was exploring avant-garde art and experimental music with Yoko Ono. George Harrison, often overshadowed, was writing some of his best material, and Ringo Starr was feeling the strain of constant conflict. During the recording of Let It Be and later Abbey Road, the fractures became more obvious. Arguments about business management, especially over who should replace their longtime manager Brian Epstein after his death, added fuel to the fire. John had grown tired of the constant battles, the relentless pressure, and the feeling that the band had become more about business than music. So, in September 1969, during a private meeting, John Lennon dropped the bombshell. He told the others he was leaving the Beatles. At the time, the news was kept quiet from the public, largely to avoid derailing album releases and business deals. But eventually, word got out, and fans across the globe were stunned. Think about what that meant. For much of the 1960s, the Beatles had defined what it meant to be young, creative, and free. They weren't just for musicians, they were cultural icons who reshaped fashion, art, politics, and even philosophy. Their breakup symbolized the end of the swinging 60s, a farewell to an era of hope and experimentation. But here's the twist. While fans mourned the split, the legacy of the Beatles only grew stronger. Lennon went on to launch a successful solo career, releasing classics like Imagine that carried forward his vision of peace and activism. McCartney formed Wings and continued producing hits. Harrison found his voice with All Things Must Pass, and Ringo carved out his own musical and acting path. Yet, despite all their solo successes, nothing quite matched the magic of those years together. Even today, when we hear a Beatles song, it instantly connects generations, reminding us of the extraordinary alchemy of four young men from Liverpool who changed the world. So, John Lennon's decision in 1969 wasn't just about leaving a band, it was about closing a chapter in cultural history. It marked the end of the Beatles as a living, breathing unit, but the beginning of their immortality as legends. And in a way, Lennon's departure cemented their place in history, not just as musicians, but as the architects of modern popular culture. In 1974, nature unleashed one of its most devastating forces on Central America. A massive hurricane, later named Hurricane Fifi, struck Honduras, leaving a trail of unimaginable destruction. The storm wasn't just a passing weather event, it was one of the deadliest natural disasters in the Western Hemisphere during the 20th century. Packing winds of over 110 miles per hour, the hurricane tore across the Caribbean and slammed into Honduras with relentless power. But it wasn't only the winds that caused catastrophe, it was the torrential rains. Over several days, Fifi dumped sheets of water that triggered widespread flooding and catastrophic mudslides. Rivers burst their banks, sweeping away homes, farmland, and entire communities. The human toll was staggering. Nearly 10,000 people lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands were left homeless. Villages were obliterated, bridges collapsed, and critical infrastructure was wiped out. For a nation already struggling economically, the hurricane's impact was crippling. The agricultural sector, Honduras's lifeline, was decimated. Banana plantations, a cornerstone of its export economy, were destroyed, leading to years of hardship and recovery struggles. International aid poured in, but the scale of the disaster highlighted just how vulnerable developing nations were to the forces of nature. Fifi was a grim reminder that hurricanes don't just destroy buildings, they shatter lives, disrupt economies, and alter the course of entire nations. What makes this tragedy even more haunting is how it reshaped the national consciousness of Honduras. Survivors told stories of entire families swept away overnight, of towns reduced to nothing but mud and debris, and of a nation forced to rebuild almost from scratch. Hurricane Fifi also spurred a new urgency in meteorology and disaster preparedness. The catastrophic loss underscored the need for better early warning systems, evacuation plans, and international cooperation in the face of natural disasters. Lessons learned from Fifi have since been applied to improve disaster response strategies worldwide. Even today, when Hondurans speak of resilience and survival, the memory of 1974 lingers. Hurricane Fifi wasn't just a storm, it was a defining moment of tragedy and endurance. It showed the fragility of human life against nature's fury, but also the unbreakable spirit of people determined to rebuild from the ruins. On September 20th, 1977, Vietnam officially became a member of the United Nations, marking a significant milestone in the country's post-war history. Just 2 years after the end of the Vietnam War, the nation emerged from decades of conflict and division, now stepping onto the global stage. Think about it. Vietnam had endured French colonial rule, a brutal war for independence, and then the devastating Vietnam War that split the country in two. Joining the UN wasn't just a diplomatic formality, it was an affirmation of sovereignty, legitimacy, and the nation's readiness to engage with the international community. The inclusion of Vietnam into the United Nations signaled the world's recognition of its reunified government. It opened doors for international cooperation, trade, and diplomacy that would help rebuild a country ravaged by decades of warfare. For the Vietnamese people, UN membership was a symbolic moment, a message that their nation could move forward, heal, and contribute to global conversations. Moreover, Vietnam's accession represented a broader shift in international relations during the Cold War era. Countries on both sides of the ideological divide began engaging with Vietnam, balancing political tensions with the need for reconstruction, humanitarian aid, and economic support. The UN became a platform where Vietnam could voice its perspectives, share its experiences, and participate in shaping global policies. It's also worth noting the broader context. Southeast Asia in the late 1970s was a region of political upheaval, rebuilding, and realignment. Vietnam's entry into the UN reflected not only its resilience, but also a step toward regional stability, dialogue, and international recognition. Even today, Vietnam's UN membership stands as a testament to its recovery, diplomacy, and determination to transform itself from a war-torn nation into an active participant in global affairs. This moment on September 20th, 1977, may seem like a single line in history books, but for the country and its people, it was the beginning of a new chapter of hope, engagement, and international cooperation. On September 20th, 1979, a dramatic shift occurred in the heart of Africa. The Central African Empire, under the controversial rule of Emperor Jean Boudel Bokassa, experienced a France-backed coup that ended his reign. Bokassa, who had declared himself emperor in 1976, became infamous for his extravagant lifestyle and oppressive governance. The country had been living under a regime marked by human rights abuses, corruption, and political instability. Bokasa's rule was widely criticized, both domestically and internationally. Yet, despite his harsh governance, the emperor retained a complicated relationship with France, the former colonial power. The coup was swift. With the support of French forces, David Decaux, the former president whom Bokassa had overthrown in 1966, was reinstated. This marked the end of one of the most controversial regimes in modern African history. For the Central African people, it was both a relief and a reminder of the fragility of political structures in post-colonial Africa. This event also highlighted the influence of foreign powers in African politics during the late 20th century. France's involvement underscored the complex interplay between former colonial powers and newly independent states, showing how geopolitics often shaped local destinies. Bokassa's ousting left a mixed legacy. While it ended his authoritarian rule, the nation continued to grapple with political instability, economic challenges, and social recovery. This single day, September 20th, 1979, became a turning point, a moment when international intervention, local politics, and history converged to change the course of a nation. Even decades later, the story of Bokassa and the Central African Empire serves as a cautionary tale of power, ambition, and the role of external influence in shaping a country's history. September 20th, 1988, marked a day of extraordinary athletic achievement. The world watched in awe as Naim Suleimanoğlu, the legendary Turkish weightlifter known as the Pocket Hercules, dominated the Olympic stage in Seoul. At just 1.47 meters tall, Naim had an astonishing combination of strength, technique, and determination that defied expectations. During the competition, he not only lifted weights that seemed impossible for his size, but also shattered 6 world records. A feat that cemented his place as one of the greatest weightlifters in history. But his story was about more than just physical prowess. Born in Bulgaria as a member of the Turkish minority, Naim faced immense personal and political challenges before he could compete for Turkey. His journey from a young athlete facing adversity to a global Olympic champion is a story of resilience, courage, and national pride. Imagine the roar of the crowd as he lifted the suspense building with every attempt and the exhilaration as records fell one by one. This moment wasn't just about gold medals, it was a testament to human determination, perseverance, and the power of chasing greatness against all odds. Naeem's performance inspired a generation of athletes worldwide, proving that dedication and talent, no matter the size of the individual, can create history. September 20th, 1988, became a date forever remembered in Olympic lore, a celebration of human potential and the unyielding spirit of champions. On September 20th, 2011, the United States took a historic step toward equality and inclusion. The controversial Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which had restricted LGBTQ+ individuals from serving openly in the military since 1993, was officially repealed. For nearly 2 decades, service members had to hide their identities, facing the risk of discharge if they revealed their sexual orientation. The repeal wasn't just a legislative change, it represented a cultural shift, acknowledging that courage, skill, and commitment are what define a soldier, not whom they love. Imagine the relief and pride of thousands of service members who could finally serve openly, without fear or secrecy. The repeal sparked national conversations about equality, civil rights, and the evolving understanding of what it means to serve one's country. This moment reflected the broader struggle for LGBTQ+ rights, illustrating that societal progress often comes through persistent effort, courage, and the willingness to challenge outdated norms. September 20th, 2011 became a symbol of inclusivity, marking a turning point in the history of civil rights in the United States. And there you have it, September 20th, a day that spans centuries of human history. From the courageous Hijra of Prophet Muhammad to Saladin's legendary siege of Jerusalem, Magellan's daring voyage around the world, Galileo's bold defiance, the birth of cinematic glamour at Cannes, Turkey's pivotal NATO membership, and the long-awaited end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Each event reminds us that history isn't just dates and names, it's about people making choices, taking risks, and shaping the world we live in today. From battles and voyages to breakthroughs in science, culture, and civil rights, September 20th shows how every action leaves a lasting mark. If you enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more historical deep dives. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode, and check the links in the description to explore even more in-depth stories behind each event. We'd love to hear from you. Which September 20th moment surprised you the most? Was it the courage of those who sailed with Magellan, the trailblazers at Cannes, or the brave individuals who finally served openly in the US military? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. History is alive, and every day a new story is being written. By understanding the past, we can better grasp the present and shape the future. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, keep learning, and keep listening to history. We'll see you in the next video.